I'm greeting you as leaders because any person that comes out on a Wednesday morning to a conference on building a country is a leader. And so if you came into the room this morning and you thought maybe, well, you're a follower, you're part of a big organization, you're part of some initiative, part of some structure, you need to recognize that there's something in you that got you out of bed to come and listen to someone as rich in knowledge as Mel Fletcher, and that makes you a leader. And in the next few years, I'm hoping that we'll see that leadership come out and we'll see you do great things with that leadership. It's a great privilege to be here this morning. Thank you, Pastor Phil and Pastor Lucinda, for having us back. I should start by saying, and I really don't say this lightly, that there's a reason why this church has been planted in this location. As I was preparing and reflecting and praying and thinking about what to share, I really, very clearly felt the Lord say that this church will be a tree planted by a river. Now that's an old scriptural image of a tree planted by a river. But you see, the scripture says the kingdom is a small seed. It's the smallest seed of all the seeds. But when it's planted, it becomes a big tree. And it becomes so big that the birds of the air can come and nest in that tree. And I believe that this church is here to become a big tree that many will come and nest in, to learn, to grow, to expand themselves, and then they will go out from this church and they'll do great things. And so I'm excited to see. Let's give God a hand for what He wants to do in this church. So I'm passionate about leadership. A few years ago, when I started feeling that I needed to leave church ministry, so working in this kind of context, I was spending some time reflecting about where I should go, what I should do, and my wife and I had a conversation, and she said, honey, what do you think, where do you think you're going? And I said to her, well, this is what's on my heart, and these are a bunch of big words. I said, it's about thought leadership for decision makers in the public sector, private sector, and civil society. And of course, my loving wife said to me, honey, that's crazy. No one does that. That's not a job. But I'm glad to say that the Lord has, over the last few years, been faithful in allowing me to get involved in all kinds of different environments, speaking to decision makers. Because you see, if you want to change a country or a continent or a generation, you better start influencing the decision makers. And so I'm privileged to say that over the last few years, I've been spending time with incredible leaders that themselves are influencers of decision makers. And just this week, we had Mel up at Gibbs speaking to miners, decision makers in the mining sector, speaking to city planners and city managers, shaping the future of South African cities. And I truly believe this is the kind of work that people of faith and people of hope are supposed to do. I'm going to share a word with you this morning very briefly on 3 shifts that I believe are necessary if we are going to have generational impact. You see, we can play small and we can do small things with small impact and small significant, or we can expand our vision and have generational impact and fundamentally change the future of a generation. But to do that is going to take a different mindset. As Mel said, leaders are all about mindset. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 shifts that I believe are needed if we are going to have generational impact. The first shift, if we can go to the next slide, the first shift is a shift from a focus on personal morality to a focus on social justice. When I travel around and I speak to leaders, and particularly people of faith and people of hope as the community that I'm part of, very often the focus, and Mel touched on this, the focus is so much on the personal and the moral that the vision we have gets limited to how we're going to take a person, an individual, and improve their life. And that's a good thing. That really is the starting point. But you see, that's like taking your car and parking your car in the garage and working on your car every day. Making it cleaner, making the engine more shiny, vacuuming the carpets and the seats and polishing the dash, and never actually turning the key on the car. The purpose of the car was never to sit in the garage and look better every day. That's an important part, keep it clean. But the purpose is to go outside and do something. And I believe it's about, in our generation, it's about this thing called social justice. I'm going to put the next picture up. and through the picture tell you a story about someone who had this revelation. So if you look at the picture, most of us will recognize at least one of the two men in the front of the picture, right? The guy standing up straight, probably the greatest statesman ever to walk the planet. Recently, when we had this racial conflict in Charlottesville in the US, Barack Obama, the former president of the United States, tweeted a quote by Nelson Mandela, and it became the most retweeted tweet of all times. So in the picture, you have a statesman, the most tweeted, quoted statesman of all time, representing civic authority. And in the wheelchair in front of him, you have an old man that most of us wouldn't know. Some of us might. That man is a man called Marius Oosthuizen. Marius Oosthuizen was a Dutch Reformed minister in South Africa during apartheid. And during apartheid, as a white Dutch Reformed minister, the Dutch Reformed Church was very closely aligned to the National Party, and so as a white male, you can imagine the privilege that he enjoyed, particularly as a leader in society. But Marius Oosthuizen had a revelation about social justice. And Marius Oosthuizen started to say, wait a minute, there's something wrong in a country where there's racial division. And over time, Marius Oosthuizen started to speak out about social justice, started to speak out against apartheid. It wasn't very long before the Dutch Reformed Church kicked him out, stripped him of his title. It wasn't long before the security police of the National Party at the time, the spies in the country, tried to kill him. Marius Oosthuizen went on to become recognized by the church as a prophet in his time because he shifted his thinking from personal morality, which is what the church was all about, to social justice. Just this week, I had the privilege of reviewing an academic paper by the dean of the business school at the University of Stellenbosch, Professor Piet Oosthuizen, happens to share the surname. And this paper was written with an economist, Dr. So-and-so, I can't remember his name, writing about the theology of inequality and the economics of inequality. So these two academics, this week, sent a paper on the theology and the economics of inequality, and the paper was published as part of a group called the Global Network for Public Theology at the Marius Oosthuizen Center for Public Theology. 50 years after his life, academics in South Africa at the university are thinking about inequality under the name of an old man called Marius Oosthuizen. And you've got the greatest statesman in the world choosing to serve the man in the wheelchair. That is a picture of the kind of influence and the kind of authority we can enjoy if we shift from personal morality to social justice. The second principle I want to share with you, if you go to the next picture there, is a shift from the particular to social change or systems change. If we look at this out of the scriptures, an example of this in the scriptures that I love is the story where Jesus comes along. He's walking through Samaria with his disciples. He gets a bit tired. He feels like sitting down and resting. You all know the story. And up comes what the scriptures call the woman at the well. And Jesus says to the woman at the well, I'm thirsty. Now we know in the story that later on when his disciples came back with the food, because he'd sent them into the town to get the food, what did he say to them? He said, I don't need your food because I'm already satisfied because I've done the work of my Father. So Jesus says to this woman at the well, I'm thirsty. And she, of course, responds and she says, well, why are you speaking to me? You're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan. And Jesus says to her, if you knew who I was that's speaking to you, you would be asking me for a drink. You see, in that moment, Jesus was doing two things. He was speaking to a woman at a well. But by speaking to a woman at a well, he was actually speaking to every woman at every well ever. And you see, when Jesus said to her, where is your husband? And she said, I have no husband. And he said to her, you've had 5 husbands, but you're still not satisfied because the water you need that will satisfy your thirst is not there. The water you need is me, is Christ. What Jesus was doing in dealing with that woman, that particular individual, through that relationship, through that conversation, he was revealing his message and his ministry to every woman ever. In fact, not only to women, but to the body of Christ, the bride, the church, who would be thirsty, whose thirst would only be satisfied once Jesus had fulfilled the will of the Father. Now, how is that relevant to you and me? You see, some of us are called to help little kids in education. Some of us are called to work in a business in a particular town. But you see, the revelation we need is in doing the particular. Our calling is not just about that one person there. Our calling goes way beyond that. There was a day when a man called Oliver Tambo took a young man in Johannesburg out to the city and went and bought him a suit and took him into his law practice. That young man was Nelson Mandela. You see, when we get called, sometimes we get so busy with the particular that we fail to understand our calling is to change the system. And sometimes God will use you to do things so that others can see what it's going to look like when you've changed the system. Now, why do we need to do that in South Africa? Let's go to the next slide. And I want to tell you a story about a town in South Africa. In the work that I do, we take our MBA students, we take them out around the province, and we visit little towns, and we visit local business, local community leaders, local schools, and we learn about local economic development. And in one particular town, the town is called Bronkhorstspruit, like a typical South African town would be called. It's, of course, near a little river called the Bronkhorstspruit. Quite creative in the naming, right? So in Bronkhorstspruit, you have a little stream running through the town. You, of course, got the old suburb where Tannie Betty stays, as we have in South Africa. Then you've got the township where Tumeleng and Mpo and everyone else stays. And then between the town and the township, you've got a mill that grinds maize into flour. And what happens is all the farmers in the area bring their maize, 80 tons of maize an hour, gets milled in this mill. The maize then goes on a truck in the form of flour that gets trucked all the way to the city where it gets baked into bread. And then the bread gets trucked all the way back to Bronkhorstspruit, where the bread gets sold in the ShopRite, and the gogo working in the house of Tannie Betty gets to buy that bread at 12 rand. So that's how the system in South Africa currently works. 30 kilometers from Bronkhorstspruit, government is building Kusile, the multi-billion rand energy project. And so we're traveling through Bronkhorstspruit, and I asked the young man who's our translator, what is the price of a prostitute in Bronkhorstspruit? Because you see, if you understand the price of a prostitute, you can understand the microeconomics of that town. And this is what he says. You can get a prostitute in Bronkhorstspruit for 50 rand. Because you see, in that system, that young girl in that township that has no job, that has no income, she has to trade something in exchange for her livelihood. So her worth, her dignity in that system is valued at 50 rand. And then he said something interesting. He said, but in Bronkhorstspruit, and he's a young man, handsome young man, he said, in Bronkhorstspruit you can't find a girlfriend. And I said, well, why can't you find a girlfriend? And he said, because all the girls are nurses to the men working at Kusile. You see, the men at Kusile become the blessers, and the young women in town become the nurses. And so when I say that we have to shift from looking at the particular, you can go into Bronkhorstspruit, you can pay for the education of a girl. But unless we change the system, we're going to continue to see the value of human beings degraded to something like 50 rand. And what happens once Kusile is finished being built and those men leave? The value of that person goes down even further. These are a couple of pictures of things that you see in Bronkhorstspruit. On the left-hand side is a railroad that used to run through that area, that used to carry industrial products. A piece of the railroad was stolen. It hasn't been replaced. Unless you change the system, the industry in that town will die. On the bottom right, you see a picture of a board in a high school, a photo that I took that reads, Martin Luther marches. So this is high school kids thinking about Martin Luther, the liberal, the rights protester in the civic movement in the US. Other forms of protest, wade-ins, kneel-ins, sit-ins, and at the bottom of the board it says, Black power movement. Why are young children in Bronkhorstspruit writing about Martin Luther and protests in their school on the whiteboard in a town called Bronkhorstspruit? Because at the top of the picture, you see a poster by a political party that says, "Our last hope for jobs and service delivery." Why are we waiting for a political party whose name involves, and this is not a political statement, I'm a commentator, not a political analyst, whose name involves economic, that's correct. The only thing I would add is it's not economic, it's socio-economic, freedom, which is good, and fighting. Because the only plan we have, the last hope at the moment for the young person in Bronkhorstspruit, is to fight. And fighting is not going to change the system. We need to build the system. And for us to build the system, we've got to shift in our thinking from the particular to system change. The third thing I want to share with you, the third principle on the next slide, is that we need to shift from this idea of it all being about my story to being about our story. You see, we live in a zeitgeist where it's all about my story. It's about my Facebook, my Twitter, my profile photo, my selfie, right? And how many likes I get for my story. And so what we do, we take pictures of my story and we put beautiful little filters on them. And I'm not bashing sharing your story. We all have a story. And that's wonderful. We should have a story. That's what makes this tapestry so beautiful. You should have a story. But we need to shift in our thinking from my small story that's all about my ego to our story. You see, if you make it about my story, your vision becomes all about you, and your resources become all about you. But if you make it about our story, there's no limit to the vision you can have, and there's no limit to the resources you can be entrusted with. In my final slide, I want to show you something that excites me no end. This is a copy of the preamble to the South African Constitution. We've been speaking about social justice. We've been speaking about the system. We've been speaking about our story. This is what our contract as a country, the contract that we have made as a society with ourselves, this is what it says. We, the people of South Africa, not I, the individual, we, the people, recognize the injustice of the past. Right there in the second sentence of our Constitution is ethics, is hope, is morality. The kind of things that people of faith should be experts on. We recognize the injustice of the past. We honor those who have suffered for justice and freedom in our land. We honor them. We recognize there's some people. There's Beyers Naudé. There's others. There's Nelson Mandela. There's Oliver Tambo. That have paid a price. We respect those who have worked to build. And those who will continue to work to build and develop our country. We believe, I love that word, it's all about vision and hope. We believe that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, united in our diversity. We therefore, and this is where we get to the exciting part, where we get our sleeves rolled up. What are we going to do as a country about this? We therefore, through our freely elected representatives, adopt this Constitution, the supreme law of the Republic, so as to, and these are the four things that I believe should be the KPIs, the key performance indicators of every leader in South Africa. Number one, heal. If we're the church, should we not be the best at healing, at bringing healing? Heal the divisions of the past and establish a society based on democratic values, social justice, and fundamental human rights. Lay the foundation for a democratic and open society in which government is based on the will, not of Saxon world or of some other suburb, but on the will of the people. And every citizen is equally protected by the law. Improve, I love this piece, talk about prosperity. Improve the quality of life of every citizen and free the potential of every person. Talk about unlocking the potential in the citizens of South Africa. and build the united and democratic South Africa, able to take its rightful place as a sovereign state among the family of nations. And then my favorite part, may God protect our people. God bless South Africa. If we are going to have generational impact, we have to shift from my story to our story. We have to shift from just focusing on the particular to changing the system. And we have to shift from being all focused on personal morality to being focused on social justice. Thank you very much.